The purpose of this video is to talk about the 5 major groups of macromolecules. So we'll go through each of these individually, talk about proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. You've probably talked somewhat about these different groups in health class, so I'm going to kind of brush over like the food angle with things. We'll talk about like what your body actually ends up using these different macromolecules for. To start off, I will begin with the lipids. A couple of things with these. For starters, lipids are what is called insoluble in water. A perfect example of this is Italian dressing. If we look at the top part of the dressing, this is the oil portion, that's the lipid, right, the fat, and then the water and all the seasoning and all that stuff, you can see kind of like settles out to the bottom. So this is considered to be a mixture, meaning like if you shake it, it kind of all mixes together, but doesn't really go into solution. Not in the sense that it's all going to stay suspended and like homogenized there and as one liquid. The reason for that is water is polar and oils are nonpolar. So lipids are nonpolar molecules. They will not dissolve in something polar like water. As far as their function goes, the most important thing that we'll talk about with lipids coming up in the next chapter is they make what's called the cell membrane, which outlines around the outside of the cell. Now, they're not the only thing in the membrane. We'll actually find out there's carbohydrates, there's lipids, there's cholesterols, there's other things that are embedded in that membrane, but lipids make up most of it. They're called phospholipids, actually. It's fat, and then it's located with a phosphate group in there. If we just talk briefly about their structure, the way lipids work, you have 2 main groups. You have what's called a glycerol group and then fatty acids. It actually takes 3 fatty acids to bond up with that glycerol. What happens here with these different elements that are shown in red, the hydrogen from the side of the glycerol group actually binds with the hydrogen and the oxygen from the end of the fatty acid. This creates water. So this is called a dehydration synthesis reaction. It gives off water molecules to bind that glycerol and the fatty acids together. What you end up producing there is called a triglyceride. I'll write that one down for you. I've learned my lesson about trying to speak and write. You would think I did. So our triglycerides, that's going to be the bonding between, again, our glycerol group and our fatty acids. The other thing to talk about lipids, there are 2 general groups. There are saturated and unsaturated. The difference here is that saturated groups are going to have all of their hydrogens. So if we look at this one, you can see that there's a huge chain of hydrogens that are coming off of here. A saturated group is going to have all of its hydrogens full. Whereas an unsaturated group is going to be missing some hydrogens. So it can actually take on more hydrogen. Generally, saturated fats are coming from animal products, so that would be like fat from beef or something like that, whereas unsaturated fats are generally coming from things like plant products like olive oil and things of that nature. The next one for us to talk about are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are actually broken down into 3 major groups. They have what are called monosaccharides, which are the things that are like the simplest group for carbohydrates. If we take a look here, glucose and fructose are 2 examples of monosaccharides. You can see there is 1 carbon ring that is developed in each of these molecules. So these are the simplest ones. We'll write that one on there for you. That's a monosaccharide. Something that's more complicated would be like sucrose. This one is a disaccharide. What that tells us is it actually has 2 of those carbon rings that are bonded together. The ones that are even more complicated than this are called polysaccharides. Glycogen is an example of a polysaccharide. Now, the thing with glycogen, This is actually what your body stores in your muscles. It stores glycogen as a long-term form of energy. So like the football team and other sports teams that like carb up before a sporting event, either the night before, the day before, something like that, that's what they're trying to do, is store all this glycogen in their muscles so they can use it then the next day when they're competing. Things like glucose, the much simpler ones, these are used for like on-demand energy. So usually you hear about somebody who's like diabetic, they'll have low blood glucose, they'll start to get real lethargic. If that gets too low, you can actually fall into a coma and have other issues with that one. Some other things that fall into our polysaccharide group, real quick, if we get that one back, it's not just glycogen. There are things like starch and cellulose. Cellulose is the material in plants that ends up being sort of important for their cell wall. We'll talk about all that stuff next chapter when we get into cells. The other big factor you should know about carbohydrates is they're important for cell signals. This is how cells communicate with each other. This is how your body determines if cells are foreign. And then just overall, know for the body, they're used as an energy source. Nucleic acids are our next one. And keep in mind, I'm trying to go through these kind of quickly to keep the video moving along. So you want to make sure you're using the pause, and the rewind feature to get all the facts. Try to keep these to under 10 minutes. It's tough because I'm trying to cover 4 different topics in this one. The nucleic acids are a little bit more simplistic to talk about than some of the other groups. But if we get our little diagram up here, there are 2 main groups for our nucleic acids. They're going to be looking at DNA and RNA. This is DNA on the right. DNA is a double helix structure. RNA is a single helix. We'll talk about some of the differences, like DNA has this one, thymine, whereas RNA has this guy abbreviated by a U, which is uracil. The thing that's important about DNA is it's composed of a monomer, meaning a smaller group. These things are called nucleotides. So that's what each of these little groups represents, the C, G, A, and T. Those represent a nucleotide group that ends up bonding to make up part of the DNA. Now, the nucleotide has a couple parts to it. We'll get into that once we're talking about DNA later on. But what you should know about nucleic acids is that these guys are what's called a polymer, meaning they are the more complex molecule. The monomer that makes them up, that's the nucleotide. As far as the other function goes, they're in charge of inheritance. So like your DNA and your RNA are the things that are important when it comes to telling your cells what to do. We'll talk about this more again with cells, but the DNA is kind of protected in the nucleus of the cell. The RNA acts as a messenger that's kind of disposable that goes out into the cell. If the RNA gets damaged, it's not a big deal. The cell can just make a new one. The DNA, though, has to be very, very carefully protected because if that's damaged, then oftentimes the cell can no longer function correctly. So we're on to our last one here. Our final one are proteins. There's quite a bit to talk about for this one. The proteins, for starters, they are the polymer group. The monomer that we need to talk about are called amino acids. So I'll write that one down for you. So again, the monomer is what's going to compose our larger structure, which means that proteins are made out of these amino acids. This picture actually does a really good job showing this. Proteins, by the way, are huge molecules. They're tremendously long chains. And all of those little circles in the chains represent amino acids. So these have different abbreviations. We'll get into these once we start talking about how DNA is copied and like what the information in DNA is used to do. You'll have a big chart with all these in there. We got like phenylalanine, leucine, serine, and cysteine. But we'll go through all of that stuff once we get to that chapter. But for now, the main thing I need you to know about proteins is that they're made out of amino acids, and then just a couple of things that they're used to do in the cell. One of the big ones that we've talked about already is they make up enzymes, which is something that's extremely important when it comes to your body being able to break down your food and just to make other products that the body needs. The other thing that's important with these is support. So they compose things like tendons and cartilage, that ends up padding and protecting your body. It's also important for your immune system. the way that we fight off bacteria and viruses, a lot of that is antibodies, which are actually made from proteins. The final thing that's important with these guys is movement. We have something called the sliding filament model, which is the idea of like how your muscles actually contract. Your muscles are made out of proteins, which is why like weightlifters and bodybuilder guys are constantly eating protein, making sure they take like protein drinks and stuff like that. It's an important thing for your muscles. And the way that the proteins slide over each other, things called actin and myosin in your muscles that slide over one another and allow you to contract and to flex that muscle, which is what allows you to move. So proteins are easily the one that go through and do the most different things for us, at least the most different things that we're going to get into and that we're going to begin analyzing in class. Just to wrap this video up, the thing you should really know for each of these is the polymer group, which is of course the main name we were talking about, the monomer, which is what it's composed of, and then you should know some of their functions, like what are the things that these different macromolecule groups are used to do. So I know that was kind of quick, but I'm trying to keep this one short. It's tough when I'm covering a lot of material like this. So again, make sure you use that rewind the pause feature when you're going through here and taking your notes and trying to get your material down. Don't forget to answer the questions when you're finished, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.